Hi, Paul here from Spitfire. Today I'm going to show you a few ideas about string voicings. So how do you arrange your chords and your parts for the string orchestra? I'm going to use the BBC Symphony Orchestra plugin and I'm going to write in a few different arrangements of a basic kind of 4-chord sequence, and we're going to see what different things sound like, and you can make a judgment about whether you like certain sounds or not. So first things first, I've got the cellos up and I'm going to look at the way that the cellos and basses interact. I'm going to put in the root note of the chord and we're going to do E flat major, going to G minor, so a kind of movement in thirds. Then we're going to resolve to C minor and then upper tone to D major. So a few different shifts there, and it should give us a little bit of an interesting variety of options of what we can do with the higher parts. But we're going to do the lower parts, just the root notes. So let me write in, first of all, the cello part. Okay, super basic, 1 chord per bar. Let's go to the basses. There are different ways of doing this. So you'll notice that the basses go down an octave lower than the cellos. So quite a lot of orchestral literature is written with the basses and cellos playing in octaves, but you can use them at unison at the same pitch. The basses read from the musical part with a little 8 underneath the bass clef, which usually means that it's read and sounds an octave below the pitch that it's written at. And so what that means is that you could share a part. If the basses and cellos are playing the same thing, if they literally play the same notes on the stave in a traditional way, the basses will sound an octave below. So let's listen to what that sounds like first. Okay, so that's quite a familiar sound. What does it sound like if we play the basses at the same pitch as the cellos, the same actual pitch? So the basses would need to be written an octave up. Okay, so you can hear the difference there between the two sounds. Now, that is useful in and of itself, but what you've got happening here is that the instruments are playing a different timbre. If you take the instruments within a certain group, so obviously the basses sound kind of their strongest down at the bottom end because they're a bass instrument. If you were talking about, for example, the flute doesn't sound very strong at the bottom of its range because it's kind of designed to play higher. So if you take that into account, but then you look at the instruments within that are kind of subgrouped together. So let's look at the cellos and basses. Where are they going to match timbrally? Well, they're going to match when they're playing in the same relative register. So the basses sound great right down the bottom. And as you go higher and higher up, they become weaker. So if you want them to match timbrally, then you need to use them down the octave from the cellos. The cellos obviously have a really extended range and they sound totally different up the top end and can sound incredibly well matched to the violas and even the violins, but we'll come to that in a little while. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to stick the basses back down the octave. Now, the first thing I'm going to try with the violas is I'm going to try using them right at the bottom of their range and just work out whatever the kind of closest note is of the chord sequence that I'm doing. I'm going to allow them to stay right down in the bottom of their range. So they go to the C below middle C is their lowest note. So that as the cellos come up, the cellos and the violas are actually quite close in pitch. And let's see what that sounds like. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. It sounds, there's an alternative way I could do it, which is I could even do that. Let's try that. Let's carry on building on this. For me, that doesn't really sound totally satisfying, but it's an effect. It sounds kind of like condensed and quite dark, and a little bit muddy. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm going to add the violin twos, and I'm going to try and stay right at the bottom of the range of the violins here as well, just to kind of condense everything down into this bottom end so you can see what the effect of that is. So I'm going to pick the notes of the chord that I can get into right at the bottom of the range, and the violins start at this G below middle C. Let's see what that sounds like. Okay, so I cheated slightly. I added a note. I went to an A on the third chord. So that turns that C minor chord from a C minor into a C minor add 6. I guess I just didn't suddenly in the moment want to go back down to the G. The open G at the bottom of the violins, you can kind of play vibrato. The way that the string players play vibrato is they usually hold another note that's not sounding. I'm guessing possibly the G above, but so you get a slight harmonic in there. But while they're bowing the open G, they kind of vibrato the ghost note, and that does give you a slight sense of movement. But basically, when you go back down to there, it's a very still sound. So that's fine. Now I'm going to again kind of squeeze down to the bottom end. So let's try B flat, D, C, D, and see what that sounds like. So you'll notice that I didn't at any point attempt to put the basses and the cellos playing a different note. Now, there is a reason for that, and I'm going to demonstrate it now. So you can hear what that sounds like, and that is our kind of basic dark voicing right at the bottom of the range there. But if instead of the cellos playing... If instead of the cellos just tracking the basses, what happens if they attempt to do a harmony with the basses? Now I'm going to use the simplest harmony possible, which is the perfect fifth. Arguable whether that's the simplest harmony possible. So the first note, obviously I can't do that because the cellos don't go down low enough, because that would be the B flat below the bottom of their range. But so let's start on the E flat, and then we'll go down to the D, which is the fifth above the root note of G. And then we'll do the G, which is the fifth above the root note of C, and then A. So we're going to have the cellos and the basses are now going to be playing, apart from the first note, they're going to be playing a fifth apart. So see what that sounds like. Okay, so again, if we kind of strip off the higher strings, then getting those playing in fifth kind of things down there, I guess it's an effect that you could use for certain things, but it's really starting to sound quite muddy. Now, what happens if we let's do the first two notes as I did then, so octave, then the fifth, then I'm going to go to thirds, so they're going to be a minor third apart for the C minor chord, which is the third chord, and then a major third apart for the fourth chord, the D major chord. Let's see what that sounds like. Okay, so the more now as we're introducing these new chords, these new intervals, where things are getting closer together, it's just becoming more and more indistinct, unsatisfying sounding and kind of muddy. So let's take that out. Let's go back to our original going in octaves. I'll pop that back in now, and then we'll look at the higher strings. What do we need to kind of define a chord? In its most basic form, we need the third. And that is the thing that gives us the most basic flavour of the chord. Is it major or minor? If we start with the idea that we're gonna do a wide voicing with the upper strings, the widest voicing we can do is to have each of those upper three parts playing exactly the same thing, but an octave apart. And in order to add a little bit of interest, I'll try and move in a different kind of direction each time. So we're getting a little bit of contrary motion. It's always a bit more interesting if the parts aren't all moving in the same direction at the same time. So let's start with the violas. Okay, that sounds okay. We've got a little bit of contrary motion. Just for one of the chords. Let's match that on the violins, up the octave, violin twos. And then again on the violin ones, up another octave. Okay, so let's just isolate those top three parts and hear them on their own. Okay, so that's an interesting, quite a strong sound, and that can be very, very useful for really punching out a melody, getting that really wide. You could even do 4 octaves and have the cellos at the bottom, but let's leave them on the bass at the moment. Let's look at a different way of voicing this. We're going to keep them quite wide apart. We're going to leave violin ones playing that part we just did at the top. For the next note, what would be the next most important note? We've got the root of everything. We've got the third of everything now. Now I'm going to put in the fifth. I don't have to put in the fifth. In some ways, the fifth is kind of a given. But for the purposes of this, I want to do this because I want to show you what it sounds like when you have the violin ones and the violin twos in that kind of third relationship or sixth relationship. So whereas the violin ones are up here for that first E flat major chord, I'm going to put violin twos starting from this B flat here. I'm doing that because I'm going to keep them quite widely spaced, so you can hear the effect of having these higher strings very widely spaced, and then we'll bring them together and put them into a close voicing. So first up, we're doing the fifth of every chord, and I'm going to, similarly to that downward and then 2 upward movements, so I'm going to do exactly the same on violin twos. So it's interesting. You can hear, obviously, they're playing a part and they're doing something, but they sound really disconnected from violin ones now, don't they? Let's put in the violas for the sake of completeness. For the violas, because we've now got our kind of three components of the triad of each chord in place, I'm going to pick a few interesting extra notes, but I'm going to keep it down here. I'm going to use the bottom octave or so of the violas, just so that everything still stays fairly widely spaced apart. So I'm using suspensions and things which you kind of think, well, they kind of should sound nice, like ninths and fourths, to give you a kind of feeling of suspension, but somehow it's not really gelling together. So let's have a look at doing something slightly different. We're going to leave the cellos and basses where they are. We're going to shift all these middle string parts up, and we're going to bring them to each one to within an octave of the higher part. So first up, we'll do violin twos. If you remember, violin ones are doing this. So I want to try and keep within an octave of that for violin twos. So first up, the first chord is that E flat chord. I'm going to again do the fifths with violin two. So I'm putting some quite rigid restrictions onto myself, but I'm going to try and keep it up. So it's right underneath what's going on up here. Okay, see that's starting now to sound a little bit more cohesive. We've got some interesting elements going on there, but we're keeping everything within an octave for those two top parts. I'm going to do exactly the same with the violas. I'm going to again add in some of these crunchy suspensions and things, but I'm going to do it and try and keep that within an octave of violin twos. So just flicking over to the score quickly, you can see violin twos are doing this B flat, D, G, A. So let's mess around somewhere up nice and close to those. Okay, that's sounding quite nice. That's a little bit too close in some places. So for my crunchy note here, I'm going to use a D on the first chord. So that's the major seventh of the E flat major chord. Then I'm going to go down to the C, which is a suspended fourth in the G minor chord. Then I'm going to drop down to an A, which is a sixth in the C minor chord. And then I'm going to go up to the C again, which is the major seventh in the D major chord. So let's see what that sounds like. Okay, so these are, as you can hear, when you get the harmonies closer together in the higher strings, you get a more of a kind of cohesive sound. You can even get them tighter than this. So let's remove that idea for the violas. So what we're going to try next is we're going to move the part that I wrote on violin twos, which as you recall is a sixth down from violin ones. And I'm going to insert the part in between. So for example, here we have the G up an octave. That's where you get that little 8 symbol above the treble clef. Means that this, for legibility, Logic has written the part, but with a transpose up an octave attached to the clef. So that's a G up the octave, and here's the B flat below that, a sixth below that. So I'm going to fill in the middle of that, and I'm actually going to go back, and we're going to forget the crunchy chord thing for now. We're just going to do our vanilla chords, and I'm just going to insert the missing note in the middle of each chord, which in this case is the E flat for the first chord. And as you probably worked out by now, it's basically tracking the root notes. It's tracking the root notes that are being played by the cello and basses, but it's actually in a slightly different, motion because we go down before we go back up. Okay, so now we've got a really close voicing there at the top, and that's sounding great. It's all of the instruments. We've got a very big gap in the middle now, so that's creating that's a little bit of a problem. And I think we'd probably benefit from pulling those instruments that are all in the gods there. They're up on the thinnest string. Let's pull them back down a bit. So we're going to transpose them all down an octave and see what that sounds like. Okay, so it's sounding quite nice, but it's still sounding kind of boring. And the reason for that is that we've just got too much stuff just going in the same direction. We haven't got any interest in the middle part, any interesting crunchy notes. Let's get rid of that the middle part that was tracking the bass line. And instead of that, let's put in a few of those interesting notes and see what that sounds like. Okay, so it's starting to come to life a little bit now. It's starting to sound more interesting. I'm going to leave that. I'm going to take the top part and I'm going to do something here with the top part and the violin twos. Now make them exactly the same, but I'm going to put that back up the octave. So now what we've got is we've got our cellos and basses playing the octave at the bottom. We've got our violas carving out a few of these kind of additional notes in the chords, just to give it a little bit of interest. We've got our violin two part, which is simply playing the root note, and then we've got the octave above that, violin one, simply playing the root note but an octave up. So we've got a wide spread of octaves in the outer parts and just one note in the middle. Are we going to lose the feeling of what chord is what? It's going to be interesting to see whether our additional notes that we put in are enough to kind of infer what's going on in the chord itself. It's interesting because I don't know whether it's the ghost of the memory of what we've been listening to, but there is a kind of inference there which helps you to imagine the missing notes of the chord. I'm going to play something slightly different, but just using a few passing notes and just see if I can get a descending line working with the rest of these strings. So one of the things that's happening now is because we've got more parts moving in different directions, it's starting to sound more interesting. I think we're getting to the point where we've exhausted this this kind of simplistic thing. Things that would make it sound more interesting if we go back to the violin twos and we start moving parts so that they're not always moving at the same time. So you can hear that all of these things are starting to add more colour into the arrangement and giving us more interesting stuff for our ears to lock onto. Let's go back, let's strip it back and let's look at the middle part of the strings and what they sound like when we use those in octaves. So I'm talking about violin twos, violas, cellos. Let's put them with the violin twos and violas at pitch and then the cellos an octave below. And we'll see what that sounds like. So we'll put a new melody in here. So let's see what that sounds like with the violas playing an octave up. Okay, so that's a nice colour. It's not super strong, and I think that what's going to happen when we add violin twos to it is that we will get a much stronger sound. So let's see what happens. So you can hear what the violin twos are bringing to the party now. And the reason for that is that you're getting, because the violins are effectively playing lower in their range, you're getting a much stronger timbral character from them. We could put violin ones on to really kind of nail that in. So let's just hear what that sounds like. Now, funnily enough, that's not really adding much change to the sound. It's not adding much change to the character of the sound because the violin twos are already doing the thing, and all we're doing is just adding a kind of density to that part. But what would be interesting would be to then try adding the violin ones an octave up. Now, they should then sound timbrally a little bit more like the violas. Now we're getting a difference, and the reason for that is that you've got the violins playing in octaves up there, are doing their own kind of character sound, but you've got the violas kind of timbrally matching those violin ones, and the cellos really are a little bit of an outlier because they kind of sound strong at the bottom and at the top. It's just that the character of the sound changes slightly. They can easily operate as part of the high strings. And in fact, we can demonstrate that by going back to the cellos. Now, originally they started here on that G, which is an octave and a half up from the bottom of the range. But they can play super high. Let's take them up an octave. So they're going even higher. So they're playing at pitch with the violas and violin twos. And let's see what that sounds like. Now, what's really great about those having those cellos right up there is that we can write some close voicings for them. I'm going to show you what that sounds like now. So we'll just use those last two chords, and I'm going to just simply arrange them so that they're in a kind of sixth thing there. So let's have the cellos right at the top of their range. We're going to do this. I'm going to put the third at the bottom of the chord. So for the C minor, going to D major. Really simple. Let's build on that. We'll take the violas. We won't have them doubling. We'll have them playing the next part up. But I'm not going to space this super close so it just sounds like a piano chord. I'm going to space it with a sixth, which seems to be a really lovely kind of distance that works really nicely in these high strings. And then taking violin twos. So we've actually got the third, then we've got the root notes. I'm going to go up and play the other kind of missing note from the chord, which is the fifth. Okay, now this is really sounding intense and fantastic. Just to show you, I would actually just I would put violin ones and twos playing the same thing in this particular case, because I like three-part voicing up high, and we've got the cellos in there. Otherwise, if the cellos weren't doing this, then I would use violin ones, twos, and violas to do the same kind of spaced out, no kind of thirds in there. So you've got the sixth at the bottom and then the fifth at the top. So just to show you what it would sound like if we added the fourth voice in, kind of in between those. If you recall, the cellos here are playing the third of each chord, so C minor to D major. We've got the violas here playing C to D, so that's the root of the chord. We've got violin twos playing the G and A, so I'm going to break with convention and stick the violin ones below the violin twos just for the purposes of illustration here. And we're going to get them to play those E flat, those thirds, the E flat, and then the F sharp in between violin twos and the violas. So that's an interesting choice as well. You can do that 4-part chord up there. What happens if we're doing this kind of close harmony up the top here? Let's delete those violin ones, and we try and put a crunchy note in the chord, kind of right in the midst of it. So I'm going to just put in the 9th for the first chord. So we're going to use a D over that C minor chord, and then I'm going to put in the 7th for the D major chord. So they just drop to the C. So now we're getting something really interesting, and getting these kind of extended chords playing in a group up high gives us a really intense sound, and it's kind of it kind of assaults your ears, and it's because of the beating of all those harmonics up really, really high. Just gives you just that feeling of, you know, passion and kind of excitement. It's a really intense sound. Now, the final thing that I want to look at, and I know we're not, there's so much that we could cover in this, but I think just to kind of keep it bite-sized, the final thing that I want to look at is what happens when you have everybody playing the same thing in octaves. And it is a really great sound. It's a sound that Christian used on his Tutankhamun, I think is the correct pronunciation, for ITV, where the kind of absolute climax of you know, an incredibly exciting cue. He's got the whole orchestra playing in octaves. I think he actually did something a little bit crazy with auto-tune as well. I can't remember if that's exactly on the same thing, but it's a great sound. So let's try it out, and we'll have cellos first up. So we're going to use the basses down the octave as traditional, as we discussed at the beginning. Then we'll pop the violas. Again, we're kind of looking at these at the lower end of the orchestra. We're looking at using the same kind of timbral thing. We've got the cellos and basses both playing, starting in their lower octave, so we'll do the same for the violas. The violas obviously start on a C, and the violins start on the G, so the lowest octave available to the violins is to start on the D above middle C, so we'll do that. And then finally, we'll put the violin ones just an octave up from there. Just going to tweak so these all end in the same place, and then just hide that for a second. Don't want to make it too exact. The basses come off last. And let's have a quick listen back to that. So again, a lovely, super powerful sound, having everybody playing the same thing. So I've only really touched on just the very beginning of investigating different voicings, but hopefully there's been something interesting and something that might be useful to you writing your own string arrangements. And please leave comments below. And if you're interested in specific pieces of music, we can look at how the strings have been arranged and why we think they might have been arranged for that. And I'm really keen to kind of start a dialogue about orchestration, because there are so many people who are incredibly talented musicians that I've met in my years of being, lucky enough to be a professional composer and professional musician. Loads of incredibly talented musicians who, because they weren't brought up, trained in the conservatoire, trained at university, as I wasn't. I don't have formal orchestration training. I'm a autodidact, I think is the word, just self-taught. They view it as a kind of barrier and kind of think that they are going to make a fool of themselves if they try and go in and experiment with things and try and use orchestral instruments in their work. And nothing is further from the truth, especially now. The current players that we have been working with, session players in London, the BBC Symphony Orchestra, the incredible orchestras around the country and smaller chamber groups around the country are all incredibly excited about working in new music. It's one of the things the BBC Symphony Orchestra say: we do new music. We love new music. They commission new music and they are very excited to play new music. So we want to get as many people writing for orchestra as possible. It's something that you can learn. You don't need to go to college to learn this stuff. It's obviously fantastic if you are lucky enough, to have had 3 years studying all of this stuff in depth with incredibly talented teachers. But we're not all lucky enough to be in that position. And so, let's learn this stuff. There's plenty of resources out there. There are mini study scores of all kinds of incredible pieces of music. There are amazing treatises on orchestration written over the last kind of 150 years. Lots of stuff. I'm going to link a few interesting books below, things that I found very interesting. So dive in, ask questions below. I'm going to try and, I don't profess to be an amazing orchestrator, but what I can do is I can take the stuff that I've been able to learn over the last 25 years and try and pass it on. And at least that is going to be helpful, hopefully, to some people. So thank you very much for watching. I hope this was of interest, and look forward to seeing you on the next one. Bye-bye.